This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
David, what is the situation in Australia? Why is it so difficult to sue the Catholic Church? Why has this scandal unfolded the way it has in Australia? What is sort of the political context for this?
Well, thank you. We are immensely grateful to the United States because it was in the early 1980s in Louisiana that some very angry Catholic parents got together and decided that they were going to do something which was almost unknown. They were going to sue the church for the damage done to their children by a particular priest called Gouty, I think his name was. And they succeeded. Now, those successes in Louisiana were like a bolt of electricity to the Catholic Church around the world, because they realised that what matters profoundly to that organisation, which is its assets, were actually under threat because of the behaviour of their priests. And all around the world, the church began, with varying degrees of speed, to begin to work on protocols for handling the looming catastrophe that was coming. Now, the church in Australia is in a peculiarly happy place, because in America, in order for the church to hold property in America, for the most part in most states, the church has to incorporate, and therefore it can be sued in a straightforward way. But in Australia, the church is in all states regarded as an unincorporated association of uncertain membership, and therefore the limits of the membership are not known. An unincorporated association with, say, 20 clearly identified members, they can be sued. But when you have thousands of people, unknown numbers of people making up your association, it can't be sued. Mm-hmm. As well as that, in Australia, the church is in a unique position. It has corralled all of its assets in trusts, which have no formal connection to the work of priests. And the courts in Australia have upheld what I think to be a diabolical notion that the property cannot be accessed by the victims because the people who hold the property have no role in supervising or hiring priests. Now, this situation cannot last in Australia. It is intolerable. The Catholic Church is uniquely privileged in this country to be able to decide for itself what it gives by way of compensation to victims. In the United States of America, the average cost to the church of each successful complaint of child abuse is $1 million. In Australia, the average payout to people by the church for a successful claim of abuse is somewhere just a little bit north of $60,000. Yeah. The church in Australia has managed to save, by the use of spectacularly clever lawyers and by absolutely brutal, hard-nosed litigation, which is one of the subjects of the newer edition of my book, The Prince, they've been able to save, probably not quite, but not far short of $1 billion. Yeah. And for any organisation that matters, it distresses me, though, that it matters so much for a church.
Right. Now, another term we keep coming up, or at least I keep coming across, that maybe we should also define for everyone who's not quite up to speed on this, is the Ellis defence. Is this?
Well, that is what I've actually essentially been talking about. The Ellis defence. John Ellis, a Sydney solicitor, sued the church, or attempted to sue the church, about 10 years ago now. Yeah. And the church, he was suing the Sydney Archdiocese, and George Pell had recently become the Archbishop of Sydney. This is insanely too much detail, but it's a detail I absolutely adore. His predecessor as Archbishop of Sydney had let down the drawbridge for a man whose hand had been mangled by being beaten by a Marrist brother. And so didn't say you can't get to the assets, said you can get to the assets, and left to a court the decision of how much this man should be paid for the damage done to his hand, which had then affected really his whole life. And a New South Wales court awarded this man over $1 million for a damaged hand. Now, this decision came just as John Ellis was suing the church for having had his life completely ruined by being raped and abused by a priest. And the church in Sydney realised that if the walls defending the assets were torn down, they would be facing damages, case by case, of much more than $1 million. And so the decision was taken to fight Ellis absolutely brutally. This was a man the church had apologised to for the abuse that had been done to him. But when they went to court, the church denied the abuse, compelled him to prove the abuse, compelled him to prove he'd been an altar boy at this particular parish at this particular time, denied the priest was actually employed by the Sydney Archdiocese. The litigation was brutal. It was a marvellous moment when, in the Royal Commission, where all of this was examined, the counsel assisting the Royal Commission said to Cardinal Pell, who was excusing everything in terms of the necessities of litigation, as advised to him by the solicitors, Cause, Chambers, Westgarth. And the counsel assisting said to Pell, "Were Cause your morals advisors, Cardinal?" It was an amazing moment. That's the Ellis defence.
One last quick question for you. So is the solution then legislation to...
Yes.
To get rid of the Ellis defence? Or how do you...
There are a couple of ways of doing it, but the simplest way to do it is to actually follow legal developments in Canada and Britain, where the courts, with roughly similar claims by the church, have said, look, you can claim there's an absolute division between what you do and your assets, but the reality is that the assets are the physical expression of your work, and therefore you cannot quarantine them. The courts have been moving in that direction for themselves in Britain. There are a couple of ways of doing it by legislation. It could be through the parliaments of Australia by Wednesday week.
Wow, okay.
And the great political struggle ahead, is for Australian politicians to find the courage to bring the Catholic Church, and it's unique amongst the churches in Australia, to bring the Catholic Church into line with ordinary corporate responsibility for the children in its care.
That's okay. Well, thank you for that overview. This is really helpful. So there is then a potential legislative solution, but this isn't, of course, going to solve all the emotional problems and the suffering of survivors, right? John, in his really remarkable book, writes, I feel I've been abused 3 times by this religious organization. First, by the effects of the original abuse whilst in their care. Secondly, by the church's denial that abuse ever occurred. And thirdly, by the church's neglect to respond honestly and compensate realistically. I mean, legislation would be wonderful, and it sounds like something very much needed, but what would that do for you?
Well, actually, I just want to add to your little bit, David, which was Brian Lucas, who is...
yes, Brian Lucas.
Good old Brian Lucas. Brian Lucas invites me down to Sydney to talk about my pastoral response to the first duty of care case in Australia that I tried to bring to the Catholic Church in 2000. And in the interview with him, he said he got very aggravated. And he said, if you think that you can come to Sydney and get more money out of us, you've got Buckley's chance. And this was a pastoral response?
Gosh.
Yeah.
And a typical response.
A typical response, yeah. And then they hid a document for 13 years that's in the back of the book, actually, of a psych report. So what they do is they'd get psychiatrists, unfortunately, who they'd say, look, to the psychiatrist, well, we want you to do this for us. If you will minimise this, then it'll help us minimise the compensation payments. And so in my psychiatric report at the time, it said because I enjoyed the abuse, look, it is funny, really. You got to laugh. Because I enjoyed the abuse, it didn't really affect me. And they had to find a place within that report and a place that wasn't a criminal offence. So they said, well, all the bullying that happened, that's where the problem was in secondary school. And so you'll never recover from that, but that's where the problem lies. And so because that's not a criminal offence, it didn't lie at that time under our duty of care policies and our due diligence policies, because that really hadn't come into Australia at that stage from the States and in 2000. So that minimised my compensation payout to George Pell giving me a letter. I've almost got it framed at home, actually. It's a letter from him and those guys, and he said, look, I've been in correspondence with and many discussions with George Pell about your case, John, and we're going to offer you, George Pell wants to offer me a compensation for what's happened, and he offered me $10,000 at that stage, and which I got $5,000. And so I framed that letter from George, and it sits nice and sweetly.
Yeah.
I'm joking, actually.
Did he sign it with a nice little cross before his name?
Actually, it was pointing down, I think, actually, the cross.
Oh, we love the cross. So, John, you also had to sign a deed of release, right? Which basically...
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, look, it's almost like a Monty Python skit. Everybody has to sign a deed of release before they get paid. So everybody
And what does that mean when you sign a deed of release?
What it means is that in both my cases, one in 98 where I was being compensated pastorally for sexual abuse when I was 10, and the other case in 2005 for the duty of care for the bullying and all that sort of stuff that occurred, and the bent fingers from being caned and everything like that, we'll offer you this money. We don't say that it's... we have any, what's the word for it?
Liability.
No liability.
Liability, thank you.
Admitting nothing.
Admitting nothing, but we'll give you this. But hang on, if you're going to take it, then we need to get you to sign this little piece of paper saying that you will never talk to anyone about it. Never.
Well, to ask a naive question, how can you then have written this book? Are you violating your deed of release?
One of the good parts about one of the good parts about being abused is that you do really wacky things every now and then, and you go, what the heck? I'm just going to do this because I believe so strongly in this. And if you figure that if we look at 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men have been sexually abused, have suffered from child abuse, and you look around you, this is a massive issue,
But seriously, can the church come after you because you're doing this?
Well, they wouldn't want to. When I talked to my solicitors about it, they said, look, they're not going to, because it'll just bring so much press to the situation. It'll be really good for you, but they're not going to be so good for them.
The church has now, in a number of statements, said that they will never enforce those deeds of release.
Oh, that's good.
That was after they first pretended they'd never asked for them. Then they had to acknowledge that they had asked for them. Now they say they won't enforce them.
Yes.
They might have worked in the past in terms of intimidating people to stay silent, but everything has changed.
Joanne, I read the commendation for the Walkley Award, and at that time it said you had interviewed over 200 survivors. I'm sure it's even more than that by now.
A hell of a lot more now.
I'm sure. Did most of them are their stories similar to John's? They had to sign deeds of release. You got less than the $60,000, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think I got 45 for the first bit for the sexual abuse, and then I got 5,000 to me, which was 10,000 for the other. And my lawyers at the time just said, John, just take it. They're not going to.
So budge. The level of detail that you have is astonishing about this.
In my case, I would say of the hundreds of people I've now interviewed, a very big percentage of those people haven't received any compensation because, I started writing about this in 2006. For a lot of those people, they were disclosing for the first time. For a lot of those people, the only people who were aware of it were, say, their partners. So compensation wasn't even on their radar. It was more the truth of their lives was not known.
Right.
So, compensation is an issue now, as it should be. But the real issue here has been just getting down the truth about the situation, which was that, thousands and thousands of people have lived lives where there's been these appalling secrets.
Did these people all find you because they knew you were writing about this? Did people come to you and?
It's funny, I've told this before, that I started on this because a man rang me up, and he was a victim of John Denham, who is a priest who's just about to be sentenced again. Now, on the record, he has 64 victims. Now, that's on the record in terms of charge sheets, in terms of, guilty pleas. There's hundreds. This man rang me up because he wanted to know why no media had reported that John Denham had been convicted of sex offences, child sex offences against him in 2000. And I don't even know why he rang me. But I said, look, I don't know, I'll check. I was raised Catholic. I was raised Catholic, good Catholic, as in my experience of priests and going to a Catholic school were all positive. So there was no agenda on my part. It was more just, OK, what's the situation here? Confirmed that, yes, John Denham had been convicted. I rang John Denham, had a lovely chat with him on the phone. At first, he denied that there had been a conviction. And, oh, no, OK, fine. So I rang and actually confirmed when he'd been convicted, had the greatest of pleasure in ringing him back. And Father Denham, you were actually convicted of child sex offences, and you were like that. And I said, well, here's the file number, and this was the date. And then his next comment, he said, well, why are you interested? I said, I was just going to write something about it in the paper. And he said, well, I hope you've got a good lawyer. And I said, oh, don't you worry about that. This is Fairfax. Piles of very well-paid lawyers will be fine. And so that planted a seed. And putting that story in the paper, which was just a few lines within another article, planted the seed for a lot of people starting to come forward. So the essential thing on this is simply what we're experiencing now is just a change in the truth, the public truth about not just the Catholic churches, but a lot of organisations' private secrets.
Well, there's a wonderful quote from George Pell in David's book where Pell says, there is a persistent press campaign against the Catholic Church's inadequacies and inadequacies in this area that does not necessarily represent the percentage of the problem that we offer. Okay, as somebody who studies journalism and loves journalism, this strikes me as an enormous story about the power of the press and about, Pell's right, isn't he? That it was work like you, just, in the weeds work.
In regions, and David and I have spoken about this, it's interesting that it was within regions first, but what's the essential nature of this? It was secrecy, organisations wanting things secret. Well, what's the role of the media?
Absolutely.
Sort of bringing things out, the truth. If you look at it from a purist point of view, now I'm not saying the media necessarily does that on all subjects.
You did in this case, and it's not. I should have said it's not just my friend Donna who thinks that Joanne's work is astonishing, but your former Prime Minister also does, which is really quite amazing, because usually the political authorities and journalists aren't always on the same page, but in this case, very much so. Yeah.
Well, I think Julia Gillard calling that Royal Commission will be seen as one of the greatest things she did.
Yeah, definitely.
And one of the things I chart in The Prince is the way in which the politicians had blocked calls for royal commissions for a long time.
What is that all about again?
Well, it is about the autonomy of the churches. It is about granting in particular to the Catholic Church, though it's not absolutely unique to the Catholic Church, but granting to the Catholic Church its ability to continue to think of itself not just as a faith, but a realm.
Right.
It's very important to understand in working out why the Catholic Church has done what it has done over the last few decades since this scandal, since they have been compelled to face this scandal, that the actions of the Church, which from the outside can at times seem inexplicable, is because they genuinely still consider themselves to be a realm with laws of their own, structures of their own. It is still an excommunicable offence in the world church for a member of the church to volunteer to the civil authorities the truth about a criminal priest unless the local law compels them. And that exception, unless the local law compels them, is only a few years old. Until very, very recently, under canon law, you could be instantly excommunicated for breaching the secrets of the church surrounding its criminal priests. And in Australia, that provides a completely bizarre situation, which is a few miles north of here in Queensland, where the old crime of misprision of felony has been abolished, and that is the crime of not reporting a crime. Up there, it is an excommunicable offence for a member of the church to go to the police and say that priest is raping children. They can be formally excommunicated for it. In New South Wales, where the old crime of misprision of felony remains in the Crimes Act, it is not an excommunicable offence because the church is not willing politically to confront the civil law in that way. Again, when you cross the Murray in Victoria, it is once again an excommunicable offence for a bishop to pick up the phone and ring the police and say, I've discovered that one of my priests is raping children. That's a contemporary, today expression of the belief of the church that they are a realm.
Right.
And that's why the only sort of actions really on that issue of not just the perpetrators but those above them have occurred in New South Wales in terms of investigations and
partly, but it's also partly because there are good bishops and good good religious organisations which have not hesitated to do the right thing, but there are not many of them.
Yeah.
Can I just add one little bit of information to this that you can Google this and do your own research, but in 1904, Pope Pius X, recognising that there were people that were molesting and raping children within the Catholic Church, and it was affecting their profit, basically, and their congregation, that he put a law in place that said we don't have to actually hand them over. We don't have to actually tell the civil system and the state authorities to do something about it. But for approximately 1,500 years, they had to do that up until 1904. And then in 1922, it was made that we have to actually contain it. Pope Pius XI decided that he wanted to contain it. And those laws really haven't changed much. They've added to those laws, but they're pretty much solidly in place. So we have.
They're not laws. They're not laws.
Yeah, okay. They're just church.
Well, they're laws until themselves. You know, they've got their own sort of belief. And I don't know why church and state come together. Do you know why church and state decide to, jump in the same bed together?
Could I actually ask something different to switch this just a little bit? Since everybody on this panel pretty much agrees, I'm going to play devil's advocate here a little bit. David, at one point you write in your book, you say there were so many abusive priests in the western half of Victoria in these years, blah, blah, blah. Here as elsewhere in the Catholic world, to denounce pedophile priests to the police was not considered pastoral. After all, forgiveness is the fundamental business of the church. And I'm wondering, are we really talking about two different paradigms here? That the church they invoke a kind of a spiritual paradigm, a moral paradigm, one of forgiveness, that these priests are sinners, that we have to understand them. Yes, we're sorry about the victims and we're so sorry, but it's fundamentally a moral forgiveness issue, whereas all of us are talking about a legal, civil, compensation paradigm. And I wonder if we could kind of bat this around for a little while. I know that both Joanne and John you're practicing Catholics, right? So
No.
All right.
No.
Okay. Misinformed.
What gave you that idea?
I gave it up.
But you know what I'm asking? What do you make of this? Aside, yes, we all agree about the civil stuff, but what do you make of this argument that it fundamentally that the church is about forgiveness?
It's rubbish. It's
rubbish.
We could do a wave on that.
The forgiveness issue. There is an aspect of it, but that is not the reason. Forgiveness has been used, and you see the word, you're right, everywhere, when bishops are assessing priests. where they know that those priests have committed crimes. But this is about, I think, more a case of power. And the priests, and they're taught that they are separate. It's that exceptionalism, as in they're forgiven because they are priests, because of the demands of being priests. I think it's a hell of a lot more. Forgiveness, in my experience, is just one more excuse used by the church for not addressing the issues.
Okay. Except that forgiveness is the business of the church.
Yes.
I mean, the business of the church is to make you feel ashamed of what you've done and offer you a mechanism for you then feeling good about yourself through forgiveness, and that forgiveness is usually mediated by the payment of money in one form or another. In some churches, it's a tithe. You know, if you're in one of the most sort of tub-thumping churches up in the hills here and down in some of the...
I think that would be we Protestants.
You know, that's many of you will have seen the Four Corners the other night about the sect down at Coffs Harbour. They were tithers, the exclusive brethren tithes, and it is about forgiveness. So the church, and this is kind of where my rage with the church finds its completely pure focus. The church sets itself up as the gateway for sexual satisfaction. They police this gateway, and while they were sheltering priests raping children, they were campaigning in New South Wales to try to stop Neville Wran decriminalising homosexuality. That was happening at exactly the same time. And so I find a kind of an interesting contradiction there, which I've spent about 30 years exploring. But they set up rules which they know human beings break. Right. They make you ashamed of breaking those rules, some of which are moral rules that really matter. Many are moral rules which are complete rubbish. They make you ashamed of them, they offer you a mechanism for dealing with that shame, and that mechanism is usually comprised of a good deal of obedience to their power, a bit of money and various other things. So, yes, forgiveness is their business. The problem is, in this case, justice isn't. Okay. The church does not, and churches tend, and there are a number of churches which tend not to have, or sections of churches tend not to have justice as part of their imagination. I like churches very much that are committed to justice because they can be wonderful.
Okay. John, what do you think about this? And what do you think about this? Is it all just hypocrisy, this forgiveness stuff?
It makes me think about what we all came here for, which was should the Catholic Church confess? I used to go to confession. Did you used to go to confession?
I did.
Yeah.
I remember it. making up sins just to sort of satisfy the priest.
Oh dear.
Sitting there as a trembling 8-year-old going, I fibbed. Wanting to get out fast.
Yeah. So, yeah, no, I thought I'd give it a bit of brevity before I got into it. Thank you for that brevity.
Sorry.
So confession to probably most of us, and let's think of the word forgiveness at the back of this word confess, is that I think every human being, I'd like to think, is a humanist, that we feel that every human being is precious. And that to confess means if I have a problem with you, or you have a problem with me, that I come to you and I say to you, I'm sorry. Not only am I sorry and I'm confessing of the situation, but we're also going to do something about it so it never happens again, especially when we're talking about something so precious in our society as human life and a child. And when a child is going through the developmental stages, when they're so vulnerable, and I use this word and I want you all to hear it, so powerful. Because when a human soul is so vulnerable, they're so powerful. They want to be educated with a moral, social, human compass by somebody who gives that to them from a divine nature. And I'm sure there are people like that in the world. But when that is abused, studies show that, when a child is abused and it's not addressed at that point where they suffer from the abuse, that they're 16 more times likely to have those effects for the rest of their lives, 16 times more. So my experience with confessing is that as I said, you confess and you reconcile. These guys don't know anything about that. They're not interested. They're interested in the money.
That's interesting.
They're interested in the money.
I agree with John there, and this is just from personal experience. The church is, sorry, there are exceptions, but let's just say as an institution, they're saying a lot of words, but the way that I'll believe the Catholic Church is ready to change when the Catholic Church embraces people like, say, David and myself and John, and actually says, you know what, these guys were right. We are nowhere near that. They are going through, they're doing what they have to do at the moment to shut everybody up. And you only have to look, say, at George Pell's evidence at the Royal Commission. And anyone who was in that room, anyone watching that, it was quite extraordinary, remarkable. And then he walked past John Ellis, sitting at the front, walked past John Ellis and did not even say anything to that man. Unbelievable. And that's the test for me.
But it was, as Joanne says, to sit there and watch Pell's evidence was remarkable. And one of the remarkably triumphant things about it was to see a great lawyer facing a great man of the church, and to see what the law, our law, can do to strip away pretense and lies. The counsel assisting the Royal Commission, Sturgis,
Gail Finesse.
Gail Finesse. Infinitely polite, never impatient. I told you one of her great zingers earlier, is cause your morals advisor, Cardinal, but for the most part, and after 2.5 days in the box, George Pell was flayed, and he had been flayed with perfect politeness. And
the knife went in, the knife came out, the blood was on the ground, and he just sat there.
And I thought to myself, this is where the church and the state come face to face. And I am very pleased to live in a country where the state can do the work that Gail Finesse did in those days and the Royal Commission did. But on the point of confession, the church cannot understand why, having apologised, we don't forgive. Because that's the mechanism in the church. You confess, you apologise, and you forgive. And Pell keeps saying, but I've apologised.
Right.
And when he became Archbishop of Melbourne, and he did a number of things when he became Archbishop of Melbourne, which were, in the terms of the church, very serious attempts to address the scandal, which he was very familiar with as an auxiliary bishop in Melbourne. And he apologised. And in 1996, when he became Archbishop of Melbourne, it was a very big step for him to apologise. And he points, and for years he pointed to that apology. I'm an archbishop and I apologised. How is it that you don't forgive? I mean, he doesn't use those words, but that's what his argument is. And the church,
that is the paradigm of the church.
That's a paradigm of the church, and we are expected to absolve the church because it's been good enough to apologise. But in a secular society, of course, we demand a great deal more of an organisation than just saying sorry.
Right. That's what I find fascinating about this, is these two different paradigms, and that's why when I asked earlier what you thought about legislation, could this problem be solved with legislation? You can't really compel people to stop being hypocritical, right? I mean,
this is about power, and the church is desperate to, it believes it still has a position in society that it's had because of this, because of the nature of what has happened, that these are abuses of power against children that took a sexual form. People are not going to get over that without the relationship between the church and people changing. It is that the church, I don't think, and particularly the Catholic Church, has not understood, that because of not only the crimes against the children, but the way the church has responded, we aren't ready. There needs to be acknowledgement, true acknowledgement by the church of what has occurred. And in a really real sense, we all know that hasn't happened yet.
Right. And legislation can't compel that either,
No,
right?
it can't. And it comes from the top.
There's nothing like financial accountability to focus people's minds, let me tell you.
Can I,
Well, that's true.
can I add something here?
Sure, please.
Thank you. Recently I was looking at how much I got paid out and how much victims get paid out. And David's pretty accurate what he says, how much we get paid out. And then looking at the post-traumatic stress disorder that occurs and all the other problems that they use to show that a payment should be made and commensurate with the effect that it's had on the victim. And then I thought, there's got to be some other people that are affected the same way, that have gone, and maybe veterans of war, they suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and other things. So in the last couple of weeks, I did some study and found a few papers on the effects that post-traumatic stress disorder has on war veterans, and whether it is similar to that of child abuse victims, and the compensation that they both get paid. And it's amazing. A war veteran, and my father went to war. I have all respect for people who serve our country. And they'll get paid possibly like a TPI or something, like a pension for the rest of their lives. But a child abuse victim will be given money, have to sign a gag order to actually receive that. And so right now I'm trying to put together the information with a parliamentarian to try and change legislation. Mm-hmm. So child abuse victims can be paid fairly for the damage that's done.
Okay. I wonder, I study journalism and Islam in Indonesia and Malaysia, and there the ulama have such power to determine, young people shouldn't be holding hands in public, and 13-year-olds should be allowed to marry, and the Shia are deviant and are not part of the church, and so that provokes all kinds of social issues. And I'm wondering, is this about the church? Is this about religion and the power of religion, that we give religious authorities enormous power, or is it just about power? I mean, in reading about, since I've been steeped in Islam for the last 3 months, thinking about the Catholic Church, I actually see a number of similarities in terms of the authority that we give to...
That's a really excellent point, because along the way in writing this stuff, I've had so many people talk about the all-powerful Catholic Church. They don't now, but certainly at the start, the all-powerful Catholic Church. And my response to that was, the minute that you look at it that way, well, that's not the right way to look at it. Nothing is all-powerful. Mm-hmm. And what's been interesting in this is that the minute that individuals started challenging the church and saying, what you're saying, that's actually not right. I was sexually abused by a priest. I'm right.
Right.
The minute that individuals started challenging it, the minute that the media started responding to it, the minute that pressure started to be brought to bear, it's amazing how quickly things change. Right. 2010, if anyone had given me $10 for saying, there will be a royal commission in 2 years, I would have laughed.
Wow.
But the thing was, once you start challenging, and you can only do it with the truth, it is amazing how quickly things change.
And I love hearing you say that, because this is a power of the press story, that it is journalists like you and courageous people like John who, by just saying, hey, speaking truth to power, we have to do this, that you're not doing what you say you're doing.
What the media did was respond to what people were telling us.
Right.
That's where it started. The real The real bravery here was the people, and I know some of them, who, even though they'd been sexually abused as children, went to, say, the police in the 1990s. If you can imagine the bravery that would have been required for somebody to walk into, you know, the local police station.
This would be like John.
Like John.
Yeah, 96.
Yep, to walk in the door, a copper behind the thing, probably a nice copper, but somebody saying, I was
lucky.
sexually
copper.
abused. And a lot of them didn't have or indifferent coppers. I mean, that's extraordinary bravery, because for people like John, for a lot of the people that I know, they just staying alive was a day-to-day proposition. If you don't trust anything in the world, including even yourself, then trusting a stranger behind a desk in a police station wearing a uniform to respond in a way that it's not the final straw for you, that's bravery. Right. You know, my writing about it was simply doing what journalists should do, which is basically going, what's the situation, and putting it out there. That's not bravery.
Oh, I'm not sure about that, but I hear your point.
I always go back to it is people speaking first. We responded.
And I think it's really important, because one of the answers, one of the ways in which all of the churches, the Catholic Church included, have defended themselves over the years is to say this is a press beat-up. And it's still being said.
Yeah.
There's a new book has just come out called The Reckoning, The Catholic Church and Child Sexual Abuse, by an old colleague of mine, Chris McGillian, and Damien Grace. And quite a large section of this book is devoted to the argument that the Catholic Church has had undue attention from the press. Gerard Henderson still attacks me and others for saying, Gerard Henderson is one of those who continues to attack people like Joanne, me, by saying we're obsessed with this problem and it's an obsession of the press. Pell says the same thing. He said it at that famous press conference when he was, you know, he had put a dozen years into the work of preventing a royal commission, but when Julia Gillard called his, he had to get up and say he welcomed it. And it's called in police parlance eating the shit sandwich. And he took that opportunity to once again put the boot into the press. It's really important to continue to emphasise that this profound change in public thinking about the behaviour of churches, in particular the Catholic Church, is driven by the angry faithful of those churches.
Yep,
that's where it starts. We can amplify it, we can make people to some extent answer questions, but that's where it comes from. And Joanne was saying earlier about everybody in the churches wants to shut us up. That's, I don't think, Joanne, quite true. I mean, my biggest fans seem to be old nuns.
No, I wasn't talking.
I mean, these fabulous old women who come up and say, I've been a nun for 60 years, thanks.
No, I agree with you. And I'm sorry if I've not made that clear. It has been certain hierarchy.
Oh, yes.
It's been certain, but believe me, it's the nun. There's some very naughty nuns out there, and I love them. Actually, just as a slight by the by, one of the gorgeous things from the New South Wales Commission of Inquiry was that they had some evidence from a nun who's a lovely woman from up in the Hunter, and she was asked to give evidence in an in-camera hearing about priests and the role of nuns within the church. And she was asked the question, would you have anything that you'd like to say? And even though I was only reading it, it just jumped out at me. And she said, well, have you got all day, I rang her after her transcript became available, and she said some quite naughty things about priests and, so what's the role of women in the church, nuns in the church or something. She said, we have to sort of, do the altar linen and make them their Sunday roast, and I loved writing that. But I rang her up and I said, look, are you fine if I actually write this? And she just laughed her head off, and I said, did you enjoy giving evidence? Because I got that impression. She said, it was wonderful.
Wow.
So, yes, got a lot of time for the nuns.
Well, I know Joanne has another session later today where you're talking about investigative reporting, and I love that the title of this section in the Herald, the Newcastle Herald, was "Shine the Light." I mean, that's what journalists do, right?
Yeah.
That's your
That
job.
was my
Not
boss.
always.
Not always, but
We hope.
But we need, actually, we want to allow the audience to ask some questions. We could always go on here for hours. Please try to ask a specific question and not make a big statement. I know everyone would love to say something. How about you in the front in the purple?
My question's to David Marr. The Prince is promoted. Could you please elaborate on Pell's move to the Vatican?
George Pell is now a genuinely powerful man in the Catholic Church. He reports directly to the Pope, and he has the responsibility of bringing some financial order to some of the Church's organisations which it appears have never in their existence been audited. And he is absolutely the man for the job. I don't mean that as a joke. I don't mean that as a joke. Pell has always had a unique relationship with the big end of any town he's been Archbishop of. He knows about getting the best lawyers, the best accountants. He is willing to spend huge whacks of the Church's money to get the very best professional advice. He has sacked most of the boards, most of the financial boards in Rome. He has got it mandated that the financial affairs of the Church will now be conducted in Italian and English. He is hiring the world's best accountants, and he has a chance, I believe, of profoundly reforming the finances of the Church. And the big thing about this job for George is that it involves absolutely no pastoral responsibilities.
Is that why they call him Big George?
He's been called Big George ever since he was at school. Because he was big then and George then.
All right. Other questions? Yes, sir.
David, could you speak to the issue of how the current head of the Whited Sepulchre, Frank the Pope, has declined the Royal Commission request to release all the paperwork about the paedophile priests in Australia, point one. Secondly, why does the Church still claim and receive moral authority on so many issues in society?
Can I ask Joanne to answer the first of those and I'll pick up the second?
oh, sorry.
Oh, no,
because it was.
all right. No, look, the refusal to provide documents is an assertion of their realm status, the independent country of the Vatican, etc., etc. I was not at all surprised that they refused. They've refused exactly similar requests from the United States and other dioceses.
United Nations as well.
And the United Nations.
And the Commission of Inquiry.
And they're just and they're just completely pig-headedly obstructionist there. And I would say it's because they have a great deal to hide.
But Frank came in saying he would be the new broom.
Yes, well, every pope comes in saying they'll be the new broom, and I remain. I mean, this man, there are some encouraging signs about this man, but I will wait until, for a few things, to see what his committee about child abuse actually does, the orders that are actually given to the church, and we'll see what that happens. I'm sorry, the second question is just...
The church still claims moral authority.
Oh, moral authority.
Lost all its moral
Now look,
authority and still claims
you've got to understand this from within the church itself. For people like Pell and very many church leaders, they understand that there is a profound challenge to the authority of the church at the moment because of this scandal. But they are talking about an organisation 2,000 years old that has been through worse, actually worse. And they have this inner confidence that things will right themselves. And in part, they have every reason to think that because there is a deep wish in a very large number of human beings to worship and to believe in a deity and to honour an organisation which is the intermediaries with that deity. It can be Islam, Christianity, it can be Buddhism. That is a deep human need, and the church satisfies that deep human need, and it goes through times of crisis, and then it goes through times of abundance. But here's something interesting that's happening in Australia. We give unique power to religious organisations in this country. For instance, the Charities Commission set up by the Gillard government, which was always a pretty weak Charities Commission compared to the commissions in New Zealand and the United Kingdom, is about to be disbanded by the present government. at the insistence of church hierarchies, essentially. Church charities themselves absolutely love the idea of a commission, but the hierarchy hates it. It's an accountability thing again. They don't want that accountability. We give a great deal of political power to churches because though we're a reasonably secular country, we're not nearly as secular a country as we like to imagine we are, but we are a reasonably secular country, we really respect people of faith. We still continue to see people of faith as good people. That's a fundamental Australian attitude, but something's shifting. The other day, there was an essential poll about the most respected organisations in Australia. And I've cited it often since because I adore it, that up the top, the ABC is the second most trusted. It goes number one, High Court. Number 2, ABC. Number 3, Reserve Bank.
Okay.
Now, religious organisations are quite a way down the list. They're I think about 15, something like that, just as a group, religious organisations, because they have quite a low, not a particularly spectacular number of people who approve or highly approve. But the really interesting thing about that figure, 41% of Australians now disapprove or greatly disapprove of religious organisations, and that is a new hostility. And if that is maintained, the political landscape and the political protection that has been offered to the churches in the past is going to change because Australians are going to demand change.
Okay. All right. Other questions? Does anyone have a question for either Joanne or John?
Yes, please.
Yes, you in the front in the green.
My question's for Joanne. I watched as that policeman seemed to be treated so badly by the police up in the Hunter.
Chief Inspector Peter Fox.
Yeah,
yes.
And he was treated as a scapegoat, and they generally tried to sort of damage his reputation. How's he travelling now?
He's Peter's actually travelling fine. Peter's a senior police officer. There was a hell of a lot going on in the Hunter at the time involving senior police officers. The police force is like any other organisation, including the media. There's always clashes of personalities. What can't be taken away from Peter Fox is that in 2004, he was calling internally for the police to hold a task force in the Hunter to look at, and he named, I've seen the report, that there were various priests, and he believed there was some kind of network and then it needed to be investigated. He continued to argue that. By the time it came to 2012, when he made his allegations on Lateline, he was on stress leave at the time, and certainly he made allegations that didn't stack up when they were addressed. But his motivations remained true for many years, which was that there was a need for the police to really intensively investigate child sexual abuse in the Hunter, and he never wavered from that. He has an enormous amount of support from the community because he actually did speak. He acted. Now, it was flawed, but he acted. And I've said it before, there was a hell of a lot more silence on this issue than there were people willing to stand up and speak. And I think that's what the community has responded to with him. He spoke. And certainly the Commission of Inquiry, the police don't like it when they're challenged, and he challenged them in a very public way. So there wasn't a hell of a lot of goodwill shown at that inquiry.
Okay. One last question? Yes, you.
This is for John. John, I attended your session last year when you did that exercise at the end, which was excellent.
What the lady said, that she attended my session last year, and I did an exercise before we all left, and she's asked me to do it again. And the funny part about it is that really touches me because I thought about doing that and I got very frightened about doing it. And she's asking me to do it. So
If it takes just like 2 minutes, we can do
it'll
it.
take probably 40 seconds.
Okay.
But you're all going to have to be maybe a little bit courageous, which is that if you know of anybody that has been affected by child abuse, would you very quietly please just stand up in silence? Remain silent and just do what you're doing. Look around and consider that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men have been affected by abuse. And education and moments like this are what gives us hope and connectivity that these institutions and cloisters or whatever it is that continues this, it's going to lift it. Look around.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you, John, and thank you, Joanne, and thank you, David, and thanks to all of you for your excellent questions.